Prior to the emergence of the Janapadas and the Mahajanapadas in the Indian subcontinent, we see a transition from the Chalcolithic culture to the Iron Age culture. This transition helped in the domestication of animals, and then we find that a lot of agricultural surplus, which also points towards a settled society. On the other hand, we also have different kind of cultural wares that were found during this period. On the west, we have the painted grey-ware, which is known as the PGW culture, and on the eastern side, we have the black and red ware, which is known as the BNR culture. So what we find is that apart from this, we have another kind of cultural assemblage where you have a kind of pottery, which is known as the northern black polished ware. But the interesting part is that the whole material milieu of this period, prior to the rise of Janapadas, was situated in the Ganga Valley. And we have the later Vedic phase of Indian culture, where the middle Ganga Valley was also the seat of civilizations. But this preluded urbanization. And during the 6th century BC, we noticed that there was a transition from chiefdom to territorial statehood, or we have another kind of monarchical system which was known as the Ganashangho type of polity. So this transition from the chiefdom to statehood, which is also known as from lineage to state, this transition actually is linked with the emergence of urban centers in early India. And what is important to notice is that with the emergence of urban centers, we find that these urban centers were located mainly in the mid-Ganga Valley. The literature are replete with such examples of urban centers, and along with literature, we have also the archaeological remains which give us an idea of the prolific urbanization of this period. What we find is that in this period, we have the emergence of the state, and along with state, we have a very solid coinage tradition. We have the rise of monarchies controlling this coinage tradition. Then we have different kinds of potteries, and this has been identified in the Indian scenario as second urbanization. What are the sources of this second urbanization? We find that, interestingly, Buddhist texts are more vocal regarding these urban centers in contrast to the Brahmanical literature. we have references in the Buddhist texts to different kinds of nagaras. But that doesn't mean that the Brahmanical literature was unaware of the nagaras. We have reference in Panini, who talks about Nagara, which was situated to the eastern part. And as Panini was located in the Sialkot region in present-day Pakistan, so by east he actually meant the Ganga Valley. Moreover, there is a kind of repulsion towards the Nagara life, towards the urban life in the Brahmanical literature. We have the Bodhana Dharma Sutra, which talks about a Nagara, a place where you have non-reading of the Vedic texts. So there was this kind of difference, an attitudinal difference towards the Nagaras in the Brahmanical literature. But if we look at the Buddhist texts, we find they are replete with examples of such Nagaras. In fact, the Mahaparinirvana Sutta talks about 80 Mahanagaras during the 18 Nagaras actually during the time of the Parinirvana of Buddha, and among these actually 6 were Mahanagaras. These 6 Mahanagaras were Champa, Rajagriha. Rajagriha, you are well aware that it is Rajgir. Champa has been identified with the Bhagalpur region in Bihar, eastern Bihar. Then we have Sravasti. Then we have Kaushambi. Then Sarnath, which is also very important for Buddhist as a Buddhist site. So it was also known as a Mahanagara. So such types of Mahanagaras are given due weightage in the Buddhist literature. Apart from these Mahanagaras, they talk also of other Nagaras like Hastinapur, then we have Ahitchatra, and these definitions of Nagaras are matched with archaeological remains also. And this is very interesting, particularly of this early historic period, where we have the proliferation of urban centers in literature, which is also matched by the archaeological profile of these areas. Now, when we look at these urban centers, we find that in these urban centers, we have lots of hierarchy. And this hierarchy, the concept of hierarchy, has been brought about by George Erdős when he was talking of the work, talking of Kaushambi. Kaushambi is a site which is near Allahabad, and there we find that we have actually 4 tiers. According to Erdős, Kaushambi is not an isolated site, and near Kaushambi we have 2 other sites known as Sringaverapura and Kara, which were to some extent around 12 hectares. But apart from this, Erdős also shows us that we have 2 other hierarchical settlements where you have sites having a concentration of the 6 hectares, and the last one is from 0.4 to 2 hectares. So when you look at this entire scenario, we find that Kaushambi actually represents the Mahanagara which we have in the Buddhist literature. So this kind of amalgamation or correlation with archaeology and text is very interesting, which we normally do not find in early Indian scenario. If we look at the literature, we find that in the literature we have descriptions of cities which has actually a rampart wall. Then over the rampart wall there are parapets, and the rampart wall, outside the rampart wall you have a moat, which is also known as parikha in Sanskrit or in Pali, and this moat is used for protection of the city. So when archaeologists excavated such urban centers like Ahitchatra or others, they found that these kind of rampart walls and the moat was very much present in the archaeological context too. And what is interesting is that building of such kind of rampart walls needed a lot of labor force, which also implies social organization. And of course, you need the techniques. So these cities had the technological foundation as well as the labor force and the social organization to have such rampart walls. For example, Rajagriha. Rajagriha was, we can was already surrounded because it was protected by the 5 hills. But even then, we have a cyclopean wall, which is to some extent about 40 meters, and which shows the kind of the technique that was used for making this wall. So here we have a kind of urbanization which is very much linked to craft specialization, linked to metallurgy, and of course the natural resources with which these things could be made. Now there is a tendency among historians who sometimes tries to connect long distance trade as the key factor of urbanization. But it is definitely a very important factor. But if we look at the urbanization process of the early historic period, we find that it was not the key factor in case of second urbanization. And this can be explained by citing an example. We can take the case of Patali Gramo. So if we look at the Pali literature does not refer to Pataliputra as a Nagara. On the other hand, it talks of Pataliputra as a Putabhedana. Putabhedana means a center of trade, a market where actually the boxes were opened. That is, it could be a sort of warehouse. So a trading center was not regarded during the time of Buddha as an urban center. But Buddha could feel the importance of Pataliputra because it was located on the confluence of Ganga and the Son, and so he prophesied that one day Pataligamo will be converted into a very important city. He used the term, in Pali we have the term Agga Nagara. So it will be an Agga Nagara, that large, very important city in the later times. And this happened in reality, that after Ajatashatru, Pataliputra became a very important city because the successor of Ajatashatru, who was Udayin from the Haryanka dynasty, he shifted his capital from Rajagriha to Pataliputra. Thus, Pataliputra became an urban center, but in the later phase of second urbanization, not in the first phase. Therefore, we can clearly say that it is not trade, cannot be the key factor in the process of urbanization. Now, if we look at the genesis of these urban centers, what we find is that these urban centers could grow for many reasons. And one of the very important reasons for the growth of these urban centers were political. We see, for example, if we can take the case of Hastinapur. Hastinapur was a very important political hub of the Kurus, and naturally it developed into a very important urban center. Pali text talks about a flood in Hastinapur, and which is again correlated by the archaeological evidence, where we have the evidence of flooding in Hastinapur. Then again we have the case of Rajagriha, where it was well protected. We have Rajghat near Varanasi, where we have a pre-urban phase, but we could see the incipient urbanism in this period because we have the northern black polished ware, of which I just mentioned before. So one point regarding the genesis of urbanization could be political. But the other very important reason for urban growth would be linked to the proliferation of people in a particular center. Urban centers were looked at areas of convergence where people from different areas used to come and meet. There were craft specialization, craftsmen was there, and it was mainly a locality where you have a very strong non-food producing group, and they were specializing in crafts and artists, and we have artisanal objects also. The third point regarding the genesis of urban centers could be a site of pilgrimage. We can have the example of Vaishali. Vaishali developed as a very important pilgrim center during the time, during the period we are referring to, that is around 6th to 5th century BC. And then we find that there are many people actually came to Vaishali as a part of pilgrimage, and there Vaishali turned into a very important urban centers with the accumulation of so much of wealth from the pilgrimage and the visits of the pilgrims to this region. Therefore, three factors which are very important for the growth of an urban center was that it could be a political center, it could be a center where people converged, a center of linkage where you have the craftspersons, and then finally it could be a pilgrimage center. Now, there are different kinds of opinions regarding the formation of an urban center, and particularly regarding the formation of second urbanization. We have two groups of historians who actually have propounded the view, and there's a debate whether iron or use of iron implements was important in the growth of our urban center. So we have D.D. Kosambi, R.S. Sharma and N.R. Banerjee, who talks about the growth of urban centers in the context of the use of iron. This is because, as I have mentioned earlier, that the 6th century BC is a phase where you have we have the proliferation of the painted graveware, and painted graveware is being equated with the Iron Age culture. Now, with the use of iron, the iron plowshares were replaced by the wooden plowshares were replaced by the iron plowshares, and when you look at the territory of the Ganga Valley, you can very well imagine that the soil with which the iron plowshares were very important for the cultivation of those soils, and therefore you have the surplus in the agrarian milieu. And when you have a surplus, it was the point of view of the historians who propounded the cause of iron use. They said that when you have a surplus, that surplus could be used for the non-fruit producing people who were living in the urban centers, and therefore naturally you have the proliferation of urban centers. So iron was taken as the key factor as in the growth of an urban center. Now, this view has been opposed by Amalananda Ghosh and D.K. Chakraborty. According to them, just the use of iron does not lead to urbanization. If this would have been, then we can very well see that we have megalithic culture, which is based on iron culture, in the southern part of India, where we do not have the emergence of urban center in this period. So second urbanization was mainly linked into North India, and particularly to the Middle Ganga Valley, because the Middle Ganga Valley was considered to be the epicenter in the case of second urbanization. So what they argued, or they tried to argue, was that you need a very strong political organization to actually handle this surplus. So it is true that there were agrarian surpluses, we had agrarian surplus, but to have the proper distribution of this surplus in the non-fruit producing area, you need a good social organization, a political organization. So herein comes the role of the state. And as I have mentioned earlier, that the rise of the Janapadas or the Mahajanapadas, that is the formation of the state, was very much linked with urbanism. We see here that it was possible for a state to actually distribute the surplus which was socially acceptable or was acceptable by all kinds of society. So the debate goes on, but more or less scholars now accept that only the use of iron or the knowledge of making iron implements cannot be the moot cause for the emergence of urban centers. So we have to link emergence of urban centers with technological innovation as well as with the strong governance or a very strong political authority. The other areas where we have experienced, see the main features of urbanization are in the area of coinage. Now, if we look at the Pali literature, we see that the Pali literature are replete with examples of its stories which talks of exchanges in kahapano. Kahapano actually meant karshapano, which was very much a part of our exchange network. Now, we do not have a definite date for the emergence of coinage tradition in India. But what we do have is that from around 5th century BC, we see that from the archaeological context, we have the coins, which are known as the punchmark coins. So these are known as the punchmark coins because the symbols that we find in the coins, these were mainly silver coins. Later on, we have examples of copper punchmark coins, but in this case, we have mainly the silver punchmark coins. And these silver punchmark coins had certain symbols, and these symbols were done with the punch technique, and therefore these are known as punched mark coins. So here again you find that the expression kahapano, which refers actually to the punchmark coins, tallies with what we have in literature and what we find from archaeological findings. And when we have coinage, it talks about a very important exchange network. So we have coinage tradition, very strong coinage tradition, and therefore this coinage tradition was linked with the exchange network of this period. And regarding when we are talking of exchange, the question of crafts, the question of artisans come into being. So you have an urban center where you have a coinage tradition, and at the same time you have a very good group of artisans who were actually making products from, and they knew the use of metallurgy. So you have metal crafts, you have potteries and different kinds. Potteries and potsherds actually loom large in the archaeological context of early historic urban India. We find two different kinds of potteries, particularly the black and red ware, and another type of pottery which has been mentioned before, the northern black polished ware, because of its lustrous polish, is identified with the period of second urbanization. So this has been termed as a kind of deluxe pottery. Deluxe because it was taken to be used only in the areas where we have urban centers. Excavations in areas where we do not have urban centers did not yield any such kind of northern black polished ware, which is commonly known as NBPW. And we are now sure, we have evidence to show that northern black polished ware was not just a kind of pottery, it was also used as an item of exchange. So these northern black polished ware were used as item of exchange for long distance trade. These Indian made or the Ganga Valley NBPW have been found in other regions of India as well as abroad. So this is a very important connection between pottery and urbanization. Now, if we look at the entire scenario, we find that the different urban centers that we have in the Indian subcontinent, particularly in the Ganga Valley, they have certain commonalities in the urban tradition, commonalities in the urbanism and the urban tradition. So the commonalities are basically linked to trade exchanges, but as I mentioned earlier, in the early period of second urbanization, trade was not the only key to urban centers, but later on we find in the latest phase that trade becomes very important. Craft specialization is very important, coinage tradition, pottery, and of course having a good organization, that is a political organization, is very important for the development of urban centers. Urban centers have been seen in two different ways. Now, one way of seeing an urban center is that it is an area of where you have a lot of activities, a area of convergence, a beehive of activities, and where people from all sectors of profession meet, gather, and exchange ideas. So this was one kind of idea. But the other idea is, or other way of looking at an urban center is, that to look at an urban space as a space which is having a proper political control, where you have a capital city and an administrative center. So these are the two different ways where historians have looked at an urban center. But in generally, urban centers are looked at or seen as a place where you have predominantly people from all factions or all factions of life. And this is what B.D. Chattopadhyay has shown us, or he sees that in an urban center, you have the cityness of a city life. And the cityness of a city life can be seen only when you have convergence or predominantly a variety of people. And finally, what we have to remember is that the rich agricultural milieu is important for the growth of an urban center. We cannot isolate the agrarian milieu from the urban milieu. So the surplus production of the agrarian milieu comes to an urban center, and which helps in the rise of an urban center, monetization, and different kinds of crafts.